Jason with Hermetheus here, and I just want to walk through some troubleshooting of roast profiles. So a customer sent me 3 different roast profiles, wanted some tips on how to improve the tracking process, and I decided that instead of just giving the settings or the things that I would change, I want to start making videos to show everyone the thought process and the data that I look at to come to my conclusions. So this is the first roast that this customer sent me. And this one is a pretty straightforward one. It's a cold roaster, partial batch size. And this shaded line down here is our burner percent. And you can see that we're flatlined here. So the PID is asking for 100% heat. But if you look over on the right-hand side of the screen, our burner is actually only at 50%, which tells us that this customer very wisely, like you need to do this, has capped the maximum heat output. And they capped it at 50%. But in this case, that's just not quite enough. Now, at this point in the roast, I wouldn't have known that. So if this is me roasting, it's normal to see 100% heat, like a flat line. That's totally normal. That's not the red flag right there. Our heat backs off just a little bit, and our curve is kind of steadily increasing until right around this point here. And that's kind of when it tapers off. And then our actual bean temperature is almost a parallel of our background profile. We're not making any progress toward that background profile. Now, again, we're a little bit below, but that's not the root cause of our issue here. We just need a little bit more heat capacity. So if I were doing this roast probably somewhere right around here, I would go into control, I would bump up a few percent, maybe as high as 55%, and I would say, okay, that setting will take effect in real time during a roast. So don't be afraid to change that maximum burner value on the fly while you're roasting. Now, this customer right here, you see this little dip that happens in the background profile. That means that this customer shifted the background profile to the right. So it gives a little more time for it to catch up. But take a look at what happens to the heat when that happens. This is new in Artisan 4.0. Well, it's not because of Artisan 4.0. It's because we use much higher P values as a result of how Artisan 4.0 works. Our really high P values now have the kind of the downside of when you shift your profile, when you're way off the curve, it removes the very error that was driving your roast. So by moving the background profile closer to your actual bean temperature, it removes the P that was driving this. So what happens in reality? You get this temporary drop in heat, and that often makes things worse than if you didn't shift it at all. My advice to this customer would be, if you're going to make that shift in the background, maybe do it back here. If you can do that sooner than later, you've got more time for it to catch up. If you're close to first crack, it's going to be tough. You'll get this drop off in heat, which makes it a little bit worse. But yeah, this whole roast could have been improved by just upping that burner value. Now, there are other problems with this roast, but the data doesn't show it very well because our biggest issue was the cap on the heat here. The next roast that I'm going to show is an identical roast, but it's a subsequent batch, so the roaster isn't cold anymore, and it does a better job of illustrating the other problems that are present here, but not very visible in the data. So let's take a look at that roast. Now, on the second roast, I want to graph a little bit more of the data that we capture. So in Artisan 4.0, if you're using our universal settings for the Copilot, we capture a ton of data in the background. And you can enable the graphing of that data by going to the config device menu and go to the extra devices. So in this case, I want to graph our set value on curve 1. And then the next thing I would suggest is checking these first 4 boxes on row 3. And the first and third boxes on row 4. And what that will do is give us all of this data here. It gives us our P term, I term, and D term. That's our PID, our calculated PID values. It gives us a lot of data about what the algorithm is doing in the background. So let's take a look at what we've got going on here. And let's first just kind of step back and make sure we're on the same page of what the issue is here. So our issue, this thin line here, is the background curve. And you'll see that once again, we just kind of parallel this curve, and it takes a little while to catch up. We finally do catch up midway between dry end and first crack, but we'd like it to happen back here. Now, unlike the previous roast that we just showed, we're not heat limited here. So this amount of heat right here, you can see we're at a 60% burner now. So the customer bumped his heat up. That's great. That's fantastic. But it's not the burner level that's our issue right here. And in fact, it's not even PID values that I would change on this one. So here's what the customer needs to change to make this type of roast work better. Something that's really unique about this roast, well, not really unique, but of note here, this is a fast roast. It's like under 8 minutes. So that's a super fast roast. And there are some PID changes that I would recommend for these super fast roasts. But the bigger issue is the start temperature of his background profile. Now, by default, the background profiles that come with the Copilot start at 175. And for the larger roasters, that's good. It's sometimes hard to get your bean temperature probe down below that level. But for his roaster, he has no problem getting his bean temperature down to like 127 is what his bean temperature bottoms at. And this gap right here is our issue with this roast right here. Now, why? Why is that big gap the issue? And in fact, if you watch some of my other PID videos, I have a section where it says error is your friend. Like you want a decent amount of error, the gap between your background profile and your bean temperature. That's what kind of jump starts the whole algorithm, but that's only true up to a point. And in this case, this gap is too big. Now, how do we know this? This is where we want to take a deeper look into these graphs right here. And we want to find out specifically which value, P or I, which value is in charge of the heat at a given point in this roast. So this purple line right here is our P value. It responds proportionately to the error, the gap between our actual bean temperature and the background probe. This kind of magenta reddish line right here, that is our I value. And by design, our I value should come up very slowly. It can't react as quickly as P, nor would we want it to. But here's the key in Artisan 4.0, and this was not the case in earlier versions. When P is above 100%, like this P value, if you look on the right, it's at 107. So P is asking for 107% burner. So mathematically speaking, Artisan will not allow the I value to even calculate. It keeps I at 0. So we ideally want our I value to start building, to start this slow building process early in our roast. And this becomes more critical the shorter your roast is, because we don't have that much time to get things on track. You know, if this was a 13-minute roast, there's no real rush in getting these things done. But in 8 minutes, yeah, we've got an issue here. And the problem is our I value stays at 0% until about the 1 minute mark. Guys, that doesn't leave enough time for I to build itself adequately for this roast. So in this case, what this customer needs to do is bring this background profile in, and in fact, every background profile that he wants to do this quickly, and lower that initial charge temp. So if his beans are getting down to like 125 or 130, I would lower this charge temperature of the background profile from 175 to 155. That's going to give us a gap of maybe 20 to 25 degrees. And mathematically speaking, a 20 to 25 degree gap, you know, at the beginning, we've only got a multiplier of around 2 on that. So a 25 degree gap would mathematically equate to somewhere around 50% burner. So our P value would max itself out around 50%, which importantly allows the I value to start building from the very first second of the roast. So this I value right here is actually what does all the heavy lifting in the entire roast from like the midpoint on. So it's super important that we build this I value up as quickly as possible. To an extent, I actually regret that I said that. Not as quickly as possible, but we want it built up fully by dry end. Now, I just misspoke, and so you might be thinking, why not just bump your I value up so that I grows much faster? Why make it take so long to grow? And you could, in very small increments, like if you really wanted to increase this I, maybe increase it by like 5 thousandths. or at the very most by an additional hundredth. So instead of 0.02, make it 0.025, or if you wanted to get really aggressive, 0.03. But the problem if you make I too high of a value is it grows too fast and you'll overshoot the curve and you'll have the exact inverse of this problem. It'll overshoot your background profile and then it'll take a long time to come down below it. And by the time it finally does come below it, it's going to struggle to get back up to it. So you actually start this really slow, difficult oscillation to get rid of. And so you're trying to find the right balance of making I come up very gently, but at the same time trying to find the right I value so that it's fully online around that dry end mark. So in this case, we lowered the charge temperature of the background profile by about 20, 25 degrees. That'll lower this initial P value, which lets our I value start building from the very first second. And then this entire roast would track better. We'll get a lot more combined heat at the beginning. I think that would have taken care of everything on this roast. There's one last thing that I want to mention on this particular roast though. On these super short roasts, mathematically speaking, I want you to take a look at our D term. That's the term in green there. So it's a negative. So right here, we're at negative 14%. So our I and our P value are mathematically combining to be nearly 100%, but then our D value is subtracting 15% heat from that. So remember the D value, it tries to kind of hit the brakes and slow things down so that we don't overshoot the background curve. It's doing this by analyzing the rate of rise of our beans. Mathematically speaking, the shorter your roast, the steeper your rate of rise, which put another way, that means the shorter your roast, the more dramatic your D value is going to be. And so it's completely reasonable that you might want to decrease your D values right down here. Now, these values, I believe, are already low. We've kind of bumped those up in some of our settings. I'm not exactly sure what this customer used because I've changed those over time. But if you're running really short roasts and you see those high D values and you feel like D is hitting the brakes too much, feel free to lower those values and that should help. Now let's take a look at the third and final roast that this customer sent. So on this third roast, largely it looks pretty good. Now we're late hitting the curve. We'd like to be on the curve back here at dry end. We missed that by a little bit, but from this 6-minute point on to the rest of the roast, looks fantastic. No issues there. So how do we get on the curve a little bit earlier? I don't have a single piece of device, but it's going to mirror everything that I just said. So the very first thing is if we lowered this charge temp a little bit, it would lower our P value. Now, if we take a look at this one, our I value actually starts building earlier in this roast. So the issue that we had with I being totally offline is not as severe as that last roast. But we could make this a little bit better just by lowering the charge temp of the background profile just a little bit. Now let's take a look at the I curve kind of from this point. Let's just call this like the 1 minute, we're a minute 15 into that roast. You can see that our I is just taking forever to build. We're taking like 4 minutes or so to build, and that's really slow. And on like a 12-minute roast, that's fine. We're happy with that. But again, this is a shorter roast here. We're 9.5 minutes. So yeah, when you're on those sub 10-minute roasts, I don't think it's unreasonable to want to bump your I values up a little bit. So again, probably around 0.025 or 0.03. Maybe bump this one up to 0.05, that middle one, just whatever. Don't take these as concrete, especially if you're in Celsius. None of these even directly apply. This is just for Fahrenheit. But take a look at what your three I values are for these three different temperature ranges. So basically this is saying at 75 degrees, use this I value and then slowly ramp them up to this I value by 350 degrees and then ramp that up to this I value at 405 degrees. So just take a look at what all three of your I values are and bump that up by 5 thousandths or even 1/100th and take a look at what that does. There's one last thing I might say on this, and it's going to seem counterintuitive. I might actually lower my maximum heat on this. Now, here's why that's counterintuitive. You might think, My problem is I'm not getting up to the background profile fast enough. So why would lowering my max heat help in this case? Well, let's take a look at the heat that's being asked for. So our cap is 60. Take a look at that burner value on the right. We're at 60 for, the first 25 seconds, and we're never up to 60% after that. We're somewhere between 36%, and then we peak out again at like 57%. In reality, I think if we would have gone with a value of 55 instead of 60, this roast could have gone better. And here's why. Our problem is this P falls off a cliff. We are closing the error gap so quickly that this P, which was having a big impact on our total burner output, it's falling out. Like the P is saying, bye guys, I'm out of here. And by the way, all the heat that I was providing is also out the door. And so by going with a lower cap on your temperature, this P value won't bring our bean temperature up as quickly. So in other words, we are approaching for this first, 2 minutes, we're approaching the background profile so quickly, our P totally drops out of the picture before our I has enough time to come into the picture. So I think that's maybe 3 different things that you could experiment, like with one or all 3 of those things, lowering your charge temp, slightly raising your I value, and maybe capping your burner heat just a tiny bit lower so that we don't approach the curve so quickly at the initial onset of this roast. Hope this helps, guys.